inch down below a 1/4 inch in height.
Okay, tacking is for.
Single is basically it stabilizes the fabric by sewing the backing and the fabric together. Single is used for smaller lettering from a 1/4 inch up to roughly below a 1/2 inch. Then you have the double underlay, which is used for rough materials. And you have to be really careful about the double underlay because you don't want to sew it on any kind of unstable fabric. An unstable fabric could be like a hat, something that's very elastic like lycra or any kind of material like that. Because what's going to happen is by the time it stitches this, the material's already shifted enough that one side or the other of this underlay would generate completely outside the stitching. So never double underlay on any kind of unstable fabric. And then you start getting into the heavier ones. Zigzag is just like the top stitching, just in a much lighter density. Zigzag is really good for bigger lettering from a 1/2 inch up. Then you have cross, which is even heavier than that. Cross is a real good underlay for your thicker columns or wider columns on a towel or a heavy sweatshirt, things like that. Then the heaviest one is netting, and I very rarely use that, but you could actually use netting as a kind of a substitute for trying to do like that 3D puff without actually using the foam. It would make the stitching really dense because it's such a heavy underlay. And then the ones with the pluses, that means that it's adding the double underlay, that edge walk around it. So any of the ones with the little plus, it means that it's a combination of zigzag and double, or netting plus double, things like that. So assuming that we're doing 1/2 inch tall lettering on a polo shirt, we would probably use the double underlay. Okay. All right, after underlay you have the fix and lock setting. This is an automatic setting in the software. Now specifically what a fix stitch is and what a lock stitch is, whenever you either start the design or right after a trim, a fix stitch is right at the beginning of that next column. What it's going to do is it's going to put 6 little bitty stitches right together, and that ties in the bobbin before it starts stitching all the rest of the column. So fix stitches at the beginning. That's why you were getting a lot of those little thread breaks yesterday. It's because stock designs notoriously filter out any type of stitching like that.
Okay, so my stock designs, there's nothing I can do about that.
You can manually go in and put them in there, but it's a lot of work.
Okay.
They filter them out. They do all kinds of filters on them. So, but you want to put it on there. Everything you create, you want to fix stitch. It's going to reduce the amount of thread breaks or pullouts you're going to have after trims. Okay. And the lock stitch is at the end of the column. Whenever it gets ready to fire the trimmer, it comes down to the end of the column. It's actually, with the lock stitch, it's actually going to start dropping little half stitches to put a knot in the column so that it doesn't unravel.
That makes sense.
Okay. So when you create stuff, you should always have it on fix and lock. Always. If you do that, you're never going to have to worry about things coming unraveled. You're also not going to have to worry about those excessive thread breaks. Alright, next after fix and lock you have the corner setting, and basically the way corners works is if you have this turned on yes, if you create a shape, a letter, or whatever it is with a corner in it, the software is automatically going to recognize what type of corner it is and put the appropriate type of stitching in there for you. This one's a mitered corner. So basically how it overlaps the pieces so you don't end up with one long stitch right here in the corner.
Right.
It's all based on the angle of the corner. You create something with a little bit different angle to it, then you're going to get a totally different type of corner. That one's a cap corner. So it overlaps about halfway and then puts a cap over it. Then the third and final one is called the swept corner, and that's when it has a real small angle to it. It doesn't add any additional stitching. It just goes right through it. So if you have corners turned on yes, it's automatically going to do that for you. Now, how it works with text and lettering is if you create a letter that has a corner in it, software is automatically going to recognize that. And it's going to put the appropriate corner in there for you. So it's putting the capped corner on the M's and the W's.
So it's just gonna do it automatically for you.
Right. Puts the mired corner in here for the L and puts the cap corner at the top of the A. So there's really no reason why you'd ever want to turn it off. Just put it on corners yes, and it'll take care of it for you. All right, the next one is the pull compensation setting. This is the most important setting in the software. By default, it's turned off, which is bad. What pull compensation is, let's say that you're going to create something as simple as like a capital letter I. So you generate this up on the screen, and you can see it looks just like a normal capital letter I.
Right.
What really is going to happen, though, is when you go to take this to sew it out, depending on the fabric, and this is assuming you're on a stable fabric, you're going to lose about 10% of this column. So instead of what it looks like on the screen, it's actually going to sew out like what you see in the green, which means that it's going to look like this.
And why is that?
All stitching sinks into the fabric.
Narrowing it up.
Right. And that's on a stable fabric. Sometimes on an unstable fabric, you may lose 25% of the column. So what pull compensation does, it actually compensates for that.
So you should leave it on full compensation at all times? Is that something you can default, or?
Yeah, basically what we've found is that on stable fabric, if you're going to lose about 10% of the column, that equates out to a setting of 0.12 inches of pull compensation. So if you look here, when I apply that pull compensation, see how it widens the column?
Right.
And when I take it out of the simulation, you can kind of see the difference with the shading. Here, the stitching stops at the edge of the shading. But here, see how it's extending out about 5% on each side?
Which will allow for that sinking in.
Right. Now, that's on stable fabric. Sometimes on unstable fabric, like say for one of those flex fit hats, where you're losing 25% of the column, you may have to go up to 20, 22, somewhere in that neighborhood. So visually, that's probably the hardest thing about learning how to work with embroidery software, is that things are not going to sew out like they appear on the screen. The adage is, if it looks good on the screen, it sews bad. If it looks bad on the screen, it sews good. You can tell by sitting here looking at this.
Right.
I mean, that red eye looks normal to if I were doing printing or whatever it is,
Right.
but it's really going to look like the green when it sews out. So I have to make it look like the blue and sometimes like the purple in order to make it stitch out really like the red. So everything on the screen is going to appear kind of fat and bold. That's the way it has to look in order to sew out properly. So you should start with the default of 0.12 on everything you create, unless you want all your stuff to look skinny and narrow. Okay. Then the last two settings are automatic settings. The first one is your short stitching, and basically what short stitching is, if you create a curved shape, what's going to happen is, be a perfectionist here. If you're doing a satin stitch, that means you have needle penetrations on the outside edge and you also have them on the inside edge. Well, as you can see, the outside edge is a much bigger surface area than the inside edge. Well, what short stitching does, if you notice when I start to zoom in, see how it's taking a percentage of those stitches on the inside and scattering them throughout the column?
Right.
So it's reducing the amount of needle penetrations in this much smaller area. If you didn't have short stitches, then everything would go to the center, and see how they're all overlapping.
Yeah.
So on thinner fabric, it would just act like a knife and cut a hole in your fabric. So always short stitches on, no matter what.
Always short stitches on.
If it needs them, it'll put them in there. And then the last one works with alignment. We talked about pull compensation, which is for the columns sinking in on the sides. Well, they're also going to bulge out on any open end. So if you use that same capital letter I, not only is the stitching going to pull in, it's also going to bulge out. So the open ends of these columns, the stitching is going to continue to push out this way and this way. You talk to digitizers, you'll hear them, they'll talk, that's the lingo they use, push and pull. Everything either pushes or pulls. So you're compensating the opposite for however it reacts. So what that means, when you do lettering and stuff like that, if you don't allow or have this half pitch compensation, what would happen would be that, say you do like an M and an S, an N, O, well, in a lot of software, other than Wings, what would happen would be that your M and your N and your A would expand because, you know, these columns overlapping each other have that open end. Then all your curved letters, like your S's, C's, E's, things like that, they're going to have a tendency to sink in. What happens is that you get this mountain range effect with your letters.
Oh yeah, big M, little S, big N, little O, big A. Yeah.
And the good thing is you don't have to worry so much about that with Wings, because if you'll notice by the little bounding box here, when you type the text, it's naturally making the S and the O bigger than the rest of the letter. See how the M and the N doesn't go all the way to the box at the top and the bottom?
Right.
That's your half pitch compensation. It's shortening those columns to allow for that push out.
So half pitch should always be on as well. Half pitch compensation should also be always on, yes.
Yeah. This is more of that if it looks good on the screen, it says bad. If it looks bad on the screen, it says good. Most people who work with printing and stuff would look at this and go,
Yeah,
ooh,
the S and
the
the
S
O
and the O are
look
bigger
bad.
than the rest of the letter.
And it looks bad. It looks like the stitch is going to be all jacked up.
Right. But that's how it has to be adjusted in order to sew properly.
So you always want it on fix and lock, corners, yes, short and long, yes, and half pitch comp, yes.
Those are your default settings. The ones you'll be adjusting occasionally would be density. You'll be picking an underlay, and you'll be making sure you have the right amount of pull compensation.
Other than that, everything else is pretty much
Defaults. Right. Okay. Let's take a little 5-minute break.